Good morning again. This is Jack Shaner, Deputy Director, Ohio Environmental Council. In just a moment, you'll be hearing from Trent Doherty, our staff attorney and Managing Director of Legal Affairs here at Ohio Environmental Council, as he outlines our proposal, the so-called Safer Gas Act. The Safer Gas Act stands for Safeguarding Appalachian Families with Environmental Regulation of Gas and Shale. Meantime, quick word from our sponsor here at the Ohio Environmental Council. We are, working daily at the Ohio State House to protect our air, land, and water for all who call Ohio home. We are a member-based nonprofit organization. Encourage everyone to join us and help with this effort to restore and strengthen quality of life for everyone here in Ohio. I'm going to introduce Trent now, who's going to detail or summarize our Safer Gas Act for you. The Safer Gas Act comprises 4 major areas for filling in the gaps in Ohio law, where the law unfortunately continues to leave Ohioans and property owners and our air and water resources vulnerable. These 4 areas are stronger safeguards against air and water pollution from oil and gas drilling, stepped up enforcement and transparency by the Ohio DNR and Ohio Environmental Protection Agency. Number 3, greater industry and government accountability, including permit appeal rights for affected citizens. And number 4, stronger consumer protections for landowners who lease their land for drilling. We will take questions at the end. You can be typing those in the question box. In the meantime, we'll accept those questions. And now, here to describe the Safer Gas Act, our proposal is Trent Doherty, Staff Attorney, Ohio Environmental Council.
Thank you, Jack. Well, before I get into the Safer Gas Act, let me paint you a little picture about the history of this. So, in March of 2011, full 2 months before the first horizontal hydraulically fractured Utica Shale well was drilled here in Ohio, the Ohio Environmental Council called on the Ohio General Assembly and the Ohio Department of Natural Resources to issue a moratorium withholding approval of new well permits involving such high-volume horizontal hydraulic drilling, exploration, or extraction until such time as the drilling practices were demonstrated to be safe for the environment and human health, and also to be properly regulated. After 2 years and over 800 horizontal drilling permits approved by the Department of Natural Resources, our call for a moratorium was essentially denied, or at least fell on deaf ears. Still, too many permits are being issued without environmental protections that are otherwise required for similar industrial activities. Too many impacted citizens are left unprotected because of a lack of transparency and accountability on the side of both the regulators and the regulated. Too many property owners are held at a disadvantage by the drilling companies who draw up heavy-handed leases, and too many polluters elude enforcement because state and local enforcers lack the tools to keep bad actors in compliance. These gaps exist, and legislation is needed to fill them. Before I get into what is actually in our proposal, a couple of things that aren't in the proposal. One, while there is some discussion about what to do with the waste from these operations, there is no specific recommendations concerning injection wells. That's by design. There's currently a proposal in front of the General Assembly for a ban on injection wells. There's been also some talk of an overhaul bill presented by a legislator on injection wells. So we've left that out. We've also not discussed or proposed what is a hot button issue, especially in Northeast Ohio, and that is concerning local control. That's an important topic and something that needs to be discussed. However, it is being discussed in front of the Ohio Supreme Court right now. In fact, there's initial briefs being filed today in that case, and the hope is to let the Supreme Court make its decision on that before the General Assembly steps in and deals with local control. But now to what's in the bill. Like Jack mentioned, we're presenting this as a mega bill, so to speak, covering 30 to 40 different areas of concern for ours, those gaps in regulation. However, we've divided them up into 4 really important areas, the first being environmental protection. The bill requires first, and I'll just talk about a couple of really the key points, 5 key points in each of these. But one is to require emissions to be established and controls on all phases of production when dealing with air pollution from these operations, and to really require and direct Ohio EPA to finish the job of establishing such air emission controls, to require monitoring of that particulate matter, the smog and ozone in counties that have more than 10 wells in play. Also to capture that methane that currently just escapes into the atmosphere. Methane, a super greenhouse gas, so to speak, even more potent than carbon dioxide when it comes to impacting our Ohio's contribution to climate change. And these 2 in particular, dealing with air emissions, ideas that didn't just come up on the top of our head. They're actually derived from the voluntary standards that the industry and enviro groups from the CSSD in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania put together. And our thought is that if this is okay for voluntary standards that were put together, and that the big players in the shale game have put their blessing on these voluntary standards, why not, for Ohio, put them into Ohio law? Going on to water, oversight of these centralized water treatment facilities. Again, as I said, we did not go into injection wells, but we are talking waste from these operations. Our proposal is to prohibit ODNR from allowing the permitting of such facilities. For example, one being the Patriot facility that takes in brine from in-state, out-of-state, brine that is full of not only deep salty water, but also fracking chemicals and possibly radioactive material in them, to properly permit them before they are then permitted to treat that brine and then send them to be discharged into waters of the state. That is the plan that has been proposed and we believe is currently going on at the Patriot facility near Warren, Ohio. We believe there are others that are being allowed to recycle, to treat these brine materials, but with really out the proper oversight from Ohio EPA. Speaking of possible radioactive material, the Kasich administration, to their credit, attempted to address radioactive material, so-called naturally occurring radioactive material that comes from these deep shale sources, and their impacts when these materials are sent to landfills. However, we do feel that the budget bill proposal for that, for those radioactive materials, does not get to the protections that Ohio needs. So our proposal amends that definition for those technologically enhanced naturally occurring radioactive materials to actually be more in line with the definitions that the US EPA and the National Academy of Sciences definition of this T-norm uses, really to make sure that we're really getting testing and proper disposal of all of the radioactive material and not letting some fit through the cracks and be sent to landfills that then can leach into our water supplies. Finally, on the environmental protection side, to take a note from the co-regulatory program here in Ohio. The bill provides for a mechanism for local communities to petition the chief of the Division of Oil and Gas Resources Management to designate certain sensitive ecological areas as unsuitable for drilling because of drilling's potential negative impact on human health, environment, and safety. Essentially what we're looking here is to follow, as I said, what happens in the co-regulatory program. If there is a proposal for an operation in an ecologically sensitive area in those public drinking water supply areas where even the smallest amount of contamination or compromise can impact the drinking water supply of an entire village or an entire region, it's important to find those and say, you just can't drill here. I think this is one of the most important, but I think one of the most overlooked sides of this is it's not saying no to drilling, it's saying not in a particular area that can impact a lot of people. So that's, again, those are 5 just snapshots of what we have proposed in the environmental protection portion of our Safer Gas Act. However, all new laws, of course, are hardly beneficial if not vigorously enforced. That's why we have a big focus on enforcement and transparency. We see gaps that still exist. Both the Ohio Department of Natural Resources and Ohio EPA need to step up their efforts to protect Ohio from the excesses of this industry. A comprehensive review of oil and gas industry enforcement in 6 states, including Ohio, was conducted just over a year ago by the environmental group Earthworks. Now, this review found that each state failed to adequately enforce existing regulations. The report was based on a detailed review of each state's laws and recent enforcement activity as supplied by each of the state's regulatory agencies. So this is just taking the state's own information. And the report found that every year, hundreds of thousands of oil and gas wells go uninspected. And in 2010, Ohio, according to this report, failed to inspect 58,000, some 91% of the active wells. These both vertical, horizontal, what have you. When inspections do uncover rule violations, the violations often are not formally recorded. Violations had been on decline in Ohio, but increased apparently in 2011. To ODNR's credit, when the number of inspections increased, more violations were found. The report continues with focusing on when violations are recorded, they typically result in no penalty. Ohio undertakes very few enforcement actions, at least according to this report, each year. And when penalties are assessed, they provide little incentive to companies to not offend again. Again, this report shows that Ohio collected less than $20,000 in penalties in 2010. We feel that there needs to be an incentive to make sure that that the players here in the shale game are complying with the law and feel the need to comply with the law, and to make sure that that communities in eastern Ohio's gas lands are protected. And the only incentive that's really out there is a strong disincentive to violate the law. And that's what our enforcement section here focuses on. First of all, it's to impose what we call a scarlet letter law on flagrant, repeat, and criminal offenders. We propose to restrict operators who knowingly violate or repeatedly violate Ohio oil and gas law to be stripped of their permit to operate. And further, to prohibit such a violator from obtaining a permit in the state of Ohio in the future. The disincentive of not being able to have your operations continue, or even to play ball in this state again, we hope is a disincentive. It's something that a few folks, a bipartisan bill in the General Assembly has focused on for injection wells, Senate Bill 46. We support that, and we say that needs to be across the board for these oil and gas operators. This scarlet letter law to say if you're a knowing violator, if you're a repeat violator, get rid of your permit and you're not allowed to have another one in the future. Similarly, again, a strong disincentive is to provide an increase in penalties to exceed the economic value, the economic benefit of violating that law. We propose that the chief have the option to seek penalties against the violator for up to twice the economic benefit received by the violator for not abiding by the law. There is an economic benefit to skirting the law. That's one of the reasons why a lot of polluters and violators in any industry do so, is because there is an economic benefit. We need to find that economic benefit and get rid of that incentive to violate by saying, you flagrant violator, you are not going to benefit. In fact, it's going to cost you even more if you want to continue to violate the law. But again, in order to do this, you need to have increased inspectors and increased inspections. We give a tip of the hat to the Kasich administration. They have increased their staff over the past 2 years. This current budget that went into effect on July 1st doubles the budget for the Division of Oil and Gas Resources Management. We are supportive of that, but we also feel that we need to make sure that there are minimum inspector to well ratios and annual inspections for each well. Going back to the report from Earthworks, we want to make sure that these wells, all of these wells, are being inspected and inspected on a regular basis, and we have the cops on the ground to make sure that these operations are abiding by the law. So let me just go. And again, it's not just enforcement, but transparency that's important. There are a lot of communities and individuals in Ohio's gas lands that feel out of the permitting process for what is happening in their backyards. People feel that they have more say in if there's a McDonald's operation that comes into their community than if there's an industrial-sized oil and gas operation that comes in. We want to change that. For oil and gas production operation permits, we feel that we need to increase notification to these affected communities and provide more consultation with local jurisdictions. The creation of good public policy which protects the health and safety and public needs is not just providing this notification, but also encouraging community input. Therefore, our proposal would impose at least a 30-day comment period as opposed to the current period, which is half that for these permits, and the ability to hold public meetings and public hearings where there's significant public interest. We think that providing this public comment and public notification hopefully can clear the air with the unknowns that are increasing in this industry. They're increasing with the influx of these operations that get permitted very quickly without any input, without any notification. Changing that, we think, will at the very least give these local communities and these residents the ability to be part of the permitting process. A lot of these permits are focused on site-specific terms and conditions, and the only folks that really know that the local impacts that these terms and conditions can have, or what these terms and conditions need to protect, are those local governments, are those local residents. Again, as I said, if there's a focus on these terms and conditions that change, and if a permit is approved, you should have the ability, if you still feel that you are going to be impacted, if your property is being impacted, if your water, if your air is, you should have the ability to appeal these permits. This is something that's currently not in the law today, to appeal such permits. If you had 100 acres of land in eastern Ohio and it was set for coal mining, you would have the ability to have that 30-day comment period to speak your mind of how it's going to impact you, and if you still feel that you were going to be adversely affected, you could appeal to the Reclamation Commission for that coal operation. That same 100 acres, if it's set for an oil and gas operation, you do not get that. You do not get that comment period. You do not get that public, that ability to appeal that permit and those terms and conditions that are so important to protecting the air, land, and water of our communities. So our proposal is to give those people that are adversely affected the right to appeal, the right to to hold the industry and the regulators accountable. Speaking of accountability, again, it's not just DNR, but it's also the industry that needs to be held accountable here. To implement and enforce these existing laws, as well as to put forward the proposals we have in the Safer Gas Act, the OEC is calling for a 5% increase on the state severance tax on oil and gas. This is very similar. It's a little bit of an increase to what the Kasich administration had proposed in their biennial budget earlier this year that was stripped out in the final version. However, unlike the governor's proposal that put it towards an income tax reduction, we want to make sure it goes to those the boots on the ground, those inspectors, that there are enough inspectors, and those inspectors are completely trained and adequately resourced to make sure that these operations are being complying with the law, as well as to provide local communities with the ability to deal with the impacts, to fund local impact remediation there for those local communities, and to identify and plug those orphan and idle oil and gas wells that pepper much of Ohio, especially in eastern Ohio, that aren't being used, that are just pathways to oil and gas. They're just avenues for underground contamination. Again, it's our proposal that this severance tax increase is not a 5% increase, but a 5% tax rate on oil and gas production. Also, when it comes to accountability, when there are decisions by the Ohio Department of Natural Resources Oil and Gas Division, those decisions are overseen by the Oil and Gas Commission. We think that the Oil and Gas Commission can be an important resource in here. However, we see one piece of that really is disturbing for us, and that is the public member of that Oil and Gas Commission does not have any prohibition to having any conflict of interest or financial interest in oil and gas operations. We have seen this occur in the past, that the public representative has been financially connected with oil and gas operations. We think that in order to promote the integrity of this commission and that commission's role in governing unitization and mandatory pooling orders that can take property owners who have said they don't want to lease and putting them into these pools and sort of forcing them to be part of these operations, that in order to keep the integrity of that, we need to make sure that public representative is truly a public representative and doesn't have ties to the oil and gas industry. So that's why we have proposed in here to revise the composition to make sure there is a true public representative and to balance the industry representatives that currently are a majority in that commission, and to amend the law to assure that the public representative has no allegiance to anyone other than the public. Just as with on the previous slide, talking about lands unsuitable for drilling, we also have a proposal similar to, again, what is in the coal regulatory program, and that is a citizen-initiated rulemaking. We propose that a member or members of the public should have the opportunity to petition the Chief of the Oil and Gas Resources to commence rulemaking on a particular issue. There are a lot of moving parts here with this oil and gas industry as it emerges here in Ohio. Again, we have 800 permits, but it's still, as we're told, it's in its infant stages. And there will be more impacts that come. There'll be new things that arise, and we want to make sure that those folks that are experiencing this firsthand in our communities have the ability to tell DNR we need to have regulations put in place over this particular issue that is emerging. So providing the opportunity for citizens to be part of the rulemaking process and initiate rulemaking we feel is important. And something that's obviously missing here in Ohio. And again, as I mentioned, it's not just Department of Natural Resources, but it's also Ohio EPA that has a role in this. The Ohio EPA's Division of Emergency Response, currently 15 statewide staff, are the 24/7 environmental cops on the beat. Their response is to derailed trains carrying petroleum, evacuations of neighborhoods due to chemical spills and explosions, such as the recent ethanol tanker explosion in Columbus, shows that their work has a direct nexus with the petroleum industry. Also, with increased drilling, production, pipelines, and export, the EPA's emergency response responsibilities and workload will only increase. So this bill would provide for the necessary financial and human resources for Ohio EPA's emergency response program, as well as increase the Public Utilities Commission's hazardous materials transportation enforcement inspections to inspect those brine haulers, and to give PUCO, hazardous materials enforcement, and EPA emergency response vehicles the authority to quickly and safely and effectively respond to fracking-related emergencies. Again, these are the ones that the state cleanup crew. They are the ones that have the expertise to get out and to respond to emergencies that face us, not just from oil and gas, but a really direct nexus to oil and gas. And they need to have, again, not only the financial resources to make sure that they can clean up these incidents when they occur, but also to have the training and the tools necessary to get to these emergencies before they become worse. Also, speaking of emergency response, this bill also strikes the current statute that provides that oil and gas drillers don't have to comply with detailed chemical inventory to local governments and notification requirements otherwise needed under the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. Local governments, when you're dealing with chemical inventories, if it's any other industry, they have the right, and they get that information from any other industry. That needs to occur with oil and gas operations, especially industrial-sized oil and gas operations that we're seeing today. It's not too much to ask that the industry comply there with what any other industry does when it comes to making sure that local governments and local communities know the chemicals that are on site in these operations. Our fourth and final area is property owner protection. It's not just the air, land, and water that are concerning, but also the rights of these property owners throughout eastern Ohio. So we focus on, as you see here, there's four areas of concern here. One, registration of landmen. We're providing that these land professionals that go out and get leases that have the role of essentially acting as a realtor, sometimes acting as a lawyer would, should be forced to be registered and regulated, just like folks in those professions do, to make sure that they are abiding by certain principles and that they have a requirement to disclose to these landowners everything that is pertinent to these operations. Require the registered land professionals provide to a prospective seller of their mineral rights a copy of either the oil and gas of an oil and gas lease disclosure form and a mineral purchase disclosure form that explains thoroughly each item that is is in that lease that talks about who is actually going to be drilling on their property, provides the background to that property, and mainly to hold those landmen and those land professionals accountable. And speaking of leases, we also have seen the need to make sure that we have modern leases, as I call them. And the concern here is there are certain things that are not being divulged to property owners once those operations occur. Now, a landowner is free to sell his surface rights and mineral rights, and understand that for at least a time period, that portion of their land is going to be off limits to them. However, it's still on their property, and you know, when there is a permit that has been issued, the landowner needs to know about that. Currently, in current law, even if the permit has been issued, the landowner isn't even notified of that happening. The landowner isn't notified when Ohio Department of Natural Resources has to be sent to that property, to that operation, to look and to inspect and to enforce a violation. So it could be a situation where there's fracking fluid released and the landowner doesn't know of it. And the landowner could have his children out there in the back 40, and I think at the very least that landowner needs to know that the DNR has been sent to inspect and enforce, so to make sure that that landowner and his family are protected. Just what otherwise would be common sense notifications that are currently in the law, put those into the law to make sure that these leases are properly put together to provide those notifications. Also, the right for the lessor, the property owner, to audit the production records of these operations. The big incentive that the oil and gas operators present to landowners is the promise of a boatload of cash coming their way in terms of royalties, and that's based on the records that are being put forth, the production records from these operations. That's where these royalties come from, and at the very least, the oil and gas, those lessors for these oil and gas operations should have the right to go to these oil and gas companies and demand an audit of their production records to make sure that they are getting the royalties they need, and the royalties they deserve. Not saying that there's anything that's going on illegal, but there is always that risk of the cooking of books, of changing those records, those production records, to keep a little bit more money in house and not give what is rightfully the landowner's royalties to them. So that's the basis of this, is to make sure that those landowners who deserve those royalties get those, and that they have the ability to audit those production records. Again, those are the highlights of our Safer Gas Act, and we've got about 30 or so individual provisions. You can check those out on our website. The press release is posted, as well as the full legislative language for each of these provisions. It's a bit of an unusual move for OEC, releasing its proposal even before we've asked the lawmaker to introduce it. What's even more unusual is we're inviting suggestions from the public, from landowners, lawmakers, regulators, even the oil and gas industry. Everyone has a stake in the adequate and responsible oversight of this industry. We invite all persons of goodwill to help us improve and pass this proposal into law. By no means do these proposed legislative changes encompass the exclusive universe of the necessary improvements to Ohio oil and gas law, nor is the proposal meant to sort of stake our parameters to what will make Ohio safe or open for business. Quite the contrary. We believe that there is still a need for DNR to move forward on rules, on those technical safety regulations that they've been sitting on for quite some time and need to continue with. This proposal is meant to address those gaps in Ohio regulation that were evident in the spring of 2011, and unfortunately, after 800 permitted horizontal wells continue to go unfilled. As with all legislative proposals, OEC's proposal aims to spark honest and robust debate and deliberation based on sound science with the goal of passing a law that's in the public interest. Health and safety is job one, and we have to get these protections right.
All right, thank you, Trent. We will now go to questions. Let's see if we can pull up some questions here. You can submit those questions in your question box. We're going to start to pull up questions. Stand by in just a moment. I will say one thing Trent mentioned several times, called our proposal a bill. And indeed, we have drafted bill language. There is, as Trent said at the conclusion, there is no bill yet. We've not yet lined up a sponsor. We haven't even asked for a sponsor. Our plan is to be very transparent and accountable, and we're putting this out there publicly, and we're asking for comment, proposals. We've done a gap analysis of Ohio law. Now we're inviting folks to do a gap analysis of our gap analysis. So we'll be eager to hear reactions, as Trent said, from the public, from property owners, from community leaders, from lawmakers, even the oil and gas industry. Okay, we have a question. Does the disclosure form include any provisions for indemnification? Trent, I assume this relates to property owners. Is that what you?
Yes, the property owners protection. Yes, there is. Excuse me, to the question. Yes, there is. In our eyes, a need for at least the oil and gas lease to contain indemnification, to contain those provisions that protect those property owners when there is problems that occur on site, whether it's a violation of Ohio law, that where penalties are enforced against the oil and gas operator. Those can't be sent to the landowner in any way, shape, or form, nor if there is any environmental impact that causes health or safety impacts outside of that surface owner's land. That property owner should not be penalized or at risk of being liable for what the oil and gas operator has done. So yes. Another question, can you clarify the tax proposal? It is a tax break. Is there any other info you can give to clarify the portion of the presentation? Yes, when it comes to the tax proposal, the severance tax, our proposal is to increase what is currently in Ohio law for the severance tax to 5% of the proceeds from drilling and extracting oil and natural gas from these operators. Let me just quickly here. Currently, the purpose of the severance tax in Ohio is to provide revenue to administer the state's regulatory program and to meet the environmental and resource management needs, and to reclaim affected land from these extraction operations. These protections to air, land, and water in local communities, we feel need to be preserved and properly applied, especially when you're talking about the influx of horizontal drilling that's happening today. So, in furtherance of the goal of the severance tax, it's in current law, to meet the environmental and resource management needs and reclaim affected land. We're urging the General Assembly to increase that severance tax to 5% and direct that increase
to hiring and training and supporting state inspectors and state emergency responders, to identify and plug these orphan and idle wells, as I mentioned, that are all around Ohio and can cause health and safety problems on their own, especially if they're in proximity to current oil and gas operations. And also to fund local impact remediation, to make sure these local communities that essentially right now have an unfunded mandate to secure their local communities from impacts from this industry, that they have the ability to get funds to remediate when there are issues, where there are impacts. Let's see here, another question. Do you have a time frame for getting comments on the draft bill, and when do you propose taking it to the legislature for finding a sponsor? I think to that issue of time frame, we're taking comments now until it's done, until it's passed. In our eyes, we think that it's a living document that can be added on as long as those comments and suggestions and amendments are positive and have a focus on really making sure that the public and our environmental resources, our human resources are protected. We want to make sure that those suggestions are in the bill. I guess officially today we're starting to take it to find sponsors, and will be throughout the next few days and weeks. But again, it's a living document. We're hoping that folks in all sectors can help add to this to make sure that we're making sure that the public is properly protected and the resources are properly protected.
Trent, we have another question from a reporter, and that is we've outlined some 30 different, I think there's 32 different changes to Ohio law that we are proposing, or changes, I should say, shoring up, strengthening of gaps that we have identified in Ohio law. We have a reporter asking, what would we identify as the single most important law change that we are proposing today?
The single most important, I think, and it's the longest overdue, is the right to appeal. It's an issue of fairness. No other industry in Ohio exhorts such an advantage under Ohio law to essentially make up the terms and conditions that aren't appealable by the people that are adversely affected. That's something that's inherent in permits from Ohio EPA dealing with all industries. However, with ODNR, oil and gas, those you do not have that opportunity as an affected individual to appeal those terms and conditions. And it holds industry and the regulators accountable. It's that piece of transparency. It's that piece of what makes true public policy good public policy, is to make sure that people have the right to be part of the regulatory process that impacts their communities, their homes, their livelihoods. And it's something that is unfortunately missing and has been missing for a long time here.
Very good. Trent, another question from a reporter, and that is, part of our proposal is to try to assure that and deter violations by making the penalty exceed the economic value that a operator may have enjoyed by violating the law. How does our proposal address that? And also, how do we avoid getting mired down in litigation? And finally, do we have some upper range on capping that penalty?
Well, currently that proposal is general, and it's just that. It's actually the language that's used in some other states that deal with violations of environmental law across the board. and it's worked in states like Maine and in other places where that deterrent is there. Now, yes, there are some details to that make it that could make it mired in some litigation. We think right now the penalty numbers are way too low. Our proposal is to make them as high as they need to be in order to deter violations. We think that that there is an economic value. I think that there are actuarial ways of finding what that economic value is and to penalize that way. And it's not a required penalty. It is the ability for the chief to choose to put that penalty in place if they can find that economic value and to penalize them that economic value or even 2 times that economic value. It is there in order to be again, a deterrent to that continued violation of the law. It's not something that is going to be penalized every time someone does a paperwork violation, but it's there for the for the Department of Natural Resources to use, another tool in their toolbox to make sure that enforcement is strong enough to create an even playing field for the industry as well as protect the people of Ohio's gaslands.
Trent, another question from a reporter about allowing communities to designate areas as off limits to drilling. Isn't that a form of local control, and therefore isn't that potentially up in the air as the Ohio Supreme Court is looking at a court case right now regarding local control? Although I would say I don't think that case is specific to the authority or ability of local communities to establish areas off limits to drilling. Also, Trent, could you talk a little bit more about our proposed proposal for lands unsuitable for drilling? I think that tracks and mirrors a portion existing Ohio law, long-standing Ohio law, that enables the State Department of Natural Resources, if I'm not wrong, to establish, designate areas off limits that are not suitable to mining.
Yes, correct. To the question, isn't it a local control question? In some way, it is. Again, as Jack said, this provision mirrors what is in the coal regulatory program that allows anyone, not just local governments, to utilize a petition to ask the Department of Natural Resources to put lands unsuitable for mining in that case and drilling in the case that we are proposing. Historically, that lands unsuitable for mining provision has been utilized by local governments to make sure that certain areas dealing with public drinking water, for example, is protected. It doesn't necessarily have to be local governments, but usually it is. But it is not exactly local control, is that it doesn't just give the right to the local community to say, no, we're not going to have drilling here because it'll impact an ecologically sensitive area. It provides the local government to petition the state to make that finding, and DNR makes the finding. And again, it provides just another tool, we think, an important tool for local governments to be part of the process, and for local communities and individuals and groups to be part of the process and say, State of Ohio, Department of Natural Resources, you have the technical and safety standards here, and you have the knowledge base, but it is the local governments and local communities that have the understanding of what's happening in their local areas, and that they should have a part in this. And this is just one piece. This lands unsuitable is one piece to providing, we think, more and better adherence to what's going on in the local communities, and to really focus on those local water impacts especially.
Okay, Trent, another question. Is the Ohio Department of Natural Resources or the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency, are they currently deficient in imposing fines for significant violators, and how would our so-called scarlet letter law work, and how would it be enforced? Would that be through the court system? Would that be through agencies? Please comment on that.
Yeah, so our proposal was what we call scarlet letter law. Again, it's adding a tool for the state's enforcement of oil and gas law. It's, currently, from our read of Ohio law, the state doesn't have an express provision that allows the Department of Natural Resources to see a continued series of violations or knowing violations and force that oil and gas operator to not only hand over their permits, and they cannot do that operation again, but to really make sure that that violator does not get another permit in Ohio. Again, it is one of those strong deterrents that we think is missing here in Ohio. But it's not really anything that's new. That's currently in the law for, in some way, shape, or form, when you're dealing with confined animal feeding operations and in landfill law, that if there are violations, you should have the ability to say you can't get another permit here in Ohio. It's not saying that presently there's anything deficient. It's just that we need to make sure that that tool is in place. And it's a tool that I think DNR has, at least for revoking a permit, has attempted to use in dealing with the violations of the injection well operator up in northeast Ohio, up in the Youngstown area. They use that to revoke. We applaud that, but we also think that there needs to be the ability to make sure that such a violator no longer gets permits in Ohio.
Trent, before we go to our next question, I just wanted to announce that to everybody that our press release is now posted online. Our press release briefly enumerates all 32 of the strengthening of Ohio law that we are requesting today, proposing today. Also, I want to point out that this webinar is being recorded, and it will be available later today or tomorrow morning, and we will be emailing out, I think, tomorrow morning the recording to all who are listening in. We have another question, Trent, and that is a question about our proposal for an across-the-board 5% severance tax rate on all oil and gas extracted in Ohio. And I believe, Trent, that is with no tax break in the first 24 months, as Governor Kasich's proposal includes, and no state income tax break whatsoever, no tax relief. It is, Trent, I believe it is strictly a 5% across-the-board severance tax on oil and gas production. But the questioner also is wondering how do we propose that the tax revenue be used?
Well, that tax revenue would be used, excuse me, to increase the inspection and enforcement of this industry at the state level. That includes giving proper resources, both financial as well as providing those tools for Department of Natural Resources inspectors, as well as Ohio EPA's emergency response. It also provides for, as I mentioned, addressing local impacts, to provide a local impact fund that local governments can utilize to cover any costs that they incur in responding to emergencies in our local communities, to covering impacts to infrastructure. Again, providing a little bit more resources there to those local governments that are that are really those first responders when there is an impact, as well as capping those old oil and gas orphan wells and idle wells that are around Ohio.
Trent, another question, and we're approaching high noon here, so this might be the last. I'll go 12:30, excuse me. So we'll take some more questions here. And that is, speaking of that tax proposal do we propose that only for the horizontal shale gas wells, or to all wells, be they horizontal or the traditional vertical wells?
And this is another way that we have also deviated from the governor's proposal. We have put this in our initial proposal as across the board, 5%. Again, if there is a suggestion that it should be just focused on the horizontal wells, we agree that there is more of a concern when it comes to these horizontal wells, these high volume, hydraulically fractured horizontal wells. That really is the focus of those of this proposal, and have been those 800 permits that we've seen come over the wire here in the past 2 years. Currently, as I said, it's 5% across the board, but that's one of the we hope is the beauty of our proposal here, is that it's a living document. We will take suggestions and take them to heart and make those amendments, any of those amendments that make sure that these operations are properly regulated, and that our regulators are properly funded to make sure that that local communities and residents are protected.
Trent, we have a question. You may have addressed this already. That court case pending at the Ohio Supreme Court. Briefly, what is that case, and do we have any idea of the timeline?
That case is the City of Monroe Falls versus Beck Energy. And that case focuses on the ability of Monroe Falls specifically, but really all local communities, to utilize their zoning authority just like they would utilize zoning authority for any other industry, to protect residential areas, protect small commercial areas. It's a long it's a long set of facts, which you can check out if you just check with the Supreme Court's website. I think, as I mentioned, there are initial briefs that were filed. The due date for the initial briefs filed by the City of Monroe Falls due today. I think they actually filed them on Friday. And in fact, as soon as I get off of this phone call, this webinar, I am going to file an amicus curiae brief, a friend of the court brief, drafted by the Ohio Environmental Council on behalf of what I believe is 27 local small independent businesses throughout eastern Ohio that have concerns and that have themselves been regulated by, so to speak, by the zoning authority, and have lived and prospered under the zoning authority, and see how the zoning authority protects not only local businesses, not only local residents, but also local businesses, and that their concerns with oil and gas operations, just like concerns with any other industrial operation, need to be looked at by local governments. So the time frame of that is the first part of the initial briefs are being filed now, and there will be more to come on replies and replies to replies over the next couple months, with the thought of oral arguments occurring sometime in 2014.
And Trent, what does that case turn on, this Monroe Falls, Ohio? Why is it so important that it's made its way all the way to the Ohio Supreme Court?
And it is an open question when it comes to the home rule authority for municipalities and their ability to regulate for the protection of their local communities' health, safety, economic development by utilizing zoning authority. Monroe Falls utilized its zoning authority not to say no to oil and gas drilling, but to say you need to abide by that zoning that any other industrial activity uses. And it's something that, for some reason, oil and gas operations have been able to get around. This Supreme Court decision hopefully will clear up any questions when it comes to the ability of local governments to use zoning. But again, it's a new twist on really what is an old Ohio constitutional right for local governments to zone to protect their residents and businesses.
Trent, we have another question. That is, as you have drafted the Safer Gas Act proposal, did you look at other states as model states, or are you breaking new ground here with the Safer Gas Act?
Yes and yes and yes. We have, where we could, we looked at other states. Some of the new proposals that came from Illinois that I think has done at least a good job in trying to get a set of regulations put in law before they start the influx. That was what we had asked 2 years ago. It's not, perhaps letter by letter the best example, but again, that's one area. We've looked at Colorado, Pennsylvania, New York, Wyoming, everywhere where there is active or potential shale play. We've looked at, but we've also looked at Ohio law. We've looked at how other industries in Ohio are being regulated and are able to thrive under regulation in Ohio, and ask the question why the oil and gas industry gets the sweetheart deal that it does to not have to abide by the same rules or the same spirit of the rules that other industries do. So it's the issue of creating a playing field in Ohio that we think is a bit out of whack when it comes to Ohio oil and gas versus every other industry in Ohio.
Okay, we have, I guess it's just a comment coming in from somebody, and that is that the Oberlin City Council has just passed some kind of home rule regarding oil and gas drilling. I see also that the City of Bowling Green City Council is poised to pass legislation, I think, to actually prohibit fracking within the city limits of Bowling Green. I do see we also have a question, you could call it a comment, from someone who's asking, do you think there's any chance of actually stopping fracking from occurring in Ohio? That is the new horizontal drilling. And I would guess, Trent, that that's partly what the Safer Gas Act is in response to, is this coming seemingly unstoppable fracking.
Yeah, it's as I mentioned when we started the webinar, that what the Safer Gas Act is part of is really an effort by OEC and a lot of other organizations back in early 2011 to make sure that the state was ahead of the game when it came to this. There were there are a lot of viewpoints on oil and gas development, shale development, from completely stopping to let it go completely without any regulations, to what we think in the middle. At the very least, what we need is to have the proper regulations put in place before we start the influx, before we wished, hopefully, before we got to 800 permits, to make sure that the public is public is protected, that the environmental and human health is properly protected through regulations. Regulations are not the only thing that's needed, but it is an integral part, and that's why we've moved forward on this. So we think that what we've presented is reasonable to, at the very least, make sure that we are ahead of the game when we get to the 2,000 permits that the Department of Natural Resources says that we'll have in the next year or so, or the 7,000 permits that are in Pennsylvania. We feel that we're in what I like to call a hindsight moment in Ohio that we didn't have with other industries. Like, you know, if we knew 100 years ago that coal mining would cause rivers to run orange in eastern Ohio, perhaps we would have moved quicker on the regulation of coal mining that was put in place in the 70s, and we're still trying to work through. If we knew 50, 60 years ago that we would be shutting down coal plants because of carbon dioxide emissions and sulfur emissions and other air pollutants, and having to shut them down because they don't have the right scrubbers in place and right protections in place, perhaps we would have saved a lot of environmental and human health impacts in those 60 years. We're in that hindsight moment with oil and gas development, with shale development in Ohio, and that's what this is focused on, is to make sure that we properly protect those people before it's too late.
I see two more questions, and one is back to our tax proposal, and that is clearly we are proposing that you're proposing a 5% across the board tax rate, severance tax rate on oil and gas production. Does our proposal extend as well to the injection of waste brine and waste material, millions of gallons coming into Ohio from out of state?
As I mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, we didn't have provisions explicitly for injection wells. There's a whole section of the Ohio Revised Code, 1509.22, and a few other subsections that deal with injection wells and actually have its own permitting fee structure in that section. Our tax proposal just focuses, as the current severance tax does, on the extraction of oil and gas. We believe that the current structure for injection well fees is way too low. We feel that there are inappropriate caps on the amount that injection well operators have to pay. There's a provision in Ohio law that says that if you go above a certain number of barrels per year, you don't have to pay any more on a fee. We think that's inappropriate. We haven't put that in here yet for the reasons I mentioned earlier when it comes to injection wells. But again, as I said, we will entertain any positive amendments and suggestions.
I see one more question that's been submitted. Before we get to that, I'll repeat that, again, the press release that describes our proposal and that includes a link to our draft statutory language, the actual draft bill language, although it's not yet been introduced, is available at our website. Trent, I think one more question. I'll scan through to see if there are any others. But does our proposal apply to drilling only on private property, drilling on public property, both? Can you help us out with that?
Yes, so the proposal is meant to be across the board when it comes to oil and gas drilling in Ohio, whether it's private property, public property held by local governments, public property held by state government. But again, a lot of it is because a lot of the development that we're aware of is occurring on private property. We need to make sure that's taken care of. There are also provisions, there's a provision in our proposal that really requires that there is a public hearing when there is a oil and gas development on public property in a local jurisdiction, a local government. Again, giving those people and residents of those local governments the ability to be notified, ability to comment on those operations that occur in their local communities, and especially that occur on public property in their local communities. There is a lot that's occurring on public and private property, and there are a lot of developments that are going to occur. And again, we feel this is a living document. If there's more that needs to be done to protect public property, we haven't addressed in this, we would definitely entertain that.
All right, I think that is the extent of our questions. Again, we'll be entertaining more questions and suggestions. You can contact us for sure. Also, again, maybe one more has come in here. We'll take a look. Also, again, take a look at our press release, which describes the proposal and also has a link to our actual draft language. I'm looking for any last questions. I don't think we have any. So again, this webinar, a recording of this webinar will be provided, will be emailed tomorrow morning, I think, to all participants. We'll also be posting it at our website. You can find all of this webinar and all of our previous webinars posted at our website. And again, on our home page is our press release, statement, and summary of all 32 proposals in the Safer Gas Act. So we will now sign off. Thank you again on behalf of Trent Doherty. This is Jack Shaner. Appreciate your participation today.